Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for the third in a 15-part series as we journey room by room through The Shining by Stephen King, a novel of father, son, and holy shit. So what happens in chapters 8, 9, and 10? The staging here is fairly simple, and that's good, because, Mama, we've got a lot of stuff to talk about. So, Chapter 8, they are in the bug, making their way towards the Overlook Hotel, up into the mountains, hoping that the bug itself does not die. Chapter 9, they enter the Overlook Hotel as everyone else is exiting the Overlook Hotel. They have a brief conversation with Ullman, and in Chapter 10, they meet Dick Halloran. He is the cook, and he is walking the family through the kitchen. And he seems to have a connection with young Danny. So the first thing that I would like to talk about in this section happens on page 94 and 95. And I am complimentary where compliments are due. This is a great little scene that builds character, builds repertoire between when you're building character, one of the things that is important as a writer to remember is that you're building repertoire between your story and your reader. The more at home we feel with characters, the more we're going to enjoy the story, regardless. You can take an extreme example, such as American Psycho and Patrick Bateman. In American Psycho, the protagonist being Patrick Bateman is sort of a psycho, not someone that you want to know. But what happens is, as we follow this individual through his life, we see little things that we recognize in ourselves. He's neurotic, yes, but he's got this idea that he strays off path, and he's just got to reset himself. How often do you and I have those thoughts? I've been trying to lose weight. Maybe I killed an entire box of fudge-dipped Oreos. That's fine. All I've got to do is find my way back to the path. Find my way back to right. And in American Psycho, he does a lot of this through his morning skin routine and through his exercise. Morning skin routines and exercise might be outlandish to some of us, but they're fairly common. Someone you know has a skin routine. Someone you know has an exercise routine. So when he does those little things in that novel, it grounds us with him. This scene, starting on 94 and bleeding into 95, she allowed Ullman, who barely came to the bulky shoulder of her fur coat, to take her arm and lead her away, presumably to his inner office. "Woo," Wendy said, smiling. "There's a dude who earns his money." "But he didn't like that lady," Danny said immediately. "He was just pretending to like her." Jack grinned down at him. "I'm sure that's true, Doc, but flattery is the stuff that greases the wheels of the world." "What's flattery?" coming from Danny. "Flattery," Wendy told him, "is when your daddy says he likes my new yellow slacks, even if he doesn't, or when he says I don't need to take off 5 pounds. Oh, is it lying for fun? Something very like that." He had been looking at her closely and now said, "You're pretty, Mommy." He frowned in confusion when they exchanged a glance and then burst into laughter. This is a moment that builds these characters into something real and tangible. And because they are real and tangible, we are able to be grounded with them, and it brings us closer to the story. Moving along, The next thing that I'd like to talk about, we spoke in a previous video, I think the first video, about watching things like numbers when they are presented to us, and when they are presented to us time and again. One of the numbers that was presented to us was the number 3. Simple number. Maybe things happen in 3s, but things seem to be happening in 3s a lot. We've got our protagonists, the 3 of them. We had the number 3 mentioned over and over again in that first chapter, and here we have a brief mention. 3 nuns sat on a sofa that was drawn up almost to the hearth itself. Here we have 3 nuns in the fire. What are we to make of that? Continuing with the theme of things we talked about in that first video, one of the other things we mentioned was seeding creepy thoughts. And that happens time and again in this chapter as well. On page 87, further west in the Sierra Nevada, the Donner Party had become snowbound and had resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Moving forward on 91, Ullman seemed truly warm toward Danny only. But Wendy had experienced that before. Danny seemed to be a child for people who ordinarily held W.C. Fields' comment about children. W.C. Fields was a comedian and witicist, and I'm assuming this is the quote that Wendy is referencing towards children. W.C. Fields quoted, "I like children if they're properly cooked." So that is, if someone knows that reference, planting a little creepy seed in their mind. Further on page 93, how fortunate, Ullman said. "I'd like to take the 3 of you out on a tour of the place a little later. And of course, Dick Halloran wants to show Mrs. Torrance the Overlook's kitchen, but I'm afraid," and he's interrupted. "But I'm afraid" is the hanging sentence. It is the sentence that is not finished and is left to roam around in the back of our minds. 94. "I have been coming to the Overlook Hotel since 1955, she was telling the smiling, shrugging clerk. "I continued to come even after my second husband died of a stroke on that tiresome Roque Court." Another seeding of the creepy that is just left to wander in the back of your brain. Further on page 104, "The food supplies amazed her, but did not reassure her as much as she might have thought. The Donner Party kept reoccurring to her." So that is a mark of someone who knows their themes and someone who knows the ambiance of their novel, much in the way that Shirley Jackson, like we mentioned before, had seeded ideas of the creepy in her novels to wander around in the back of your brain. And remember Shirley Jackson, because we're going to be coming back to her later in this episode. But one of the other things that we've mentioned watching going forward are colors. And this is something that I tried to make a big deal out of in a paper when I was still in college. I wrote a paper on this as an undergraduate. But I think it's important to focus on the difference of hot colors and cold colors. And if you come to something else, by all means, let it be known in the comment section, because I never really came to an answer. But speaking of Wendy, she was wearing her blue dress, the one that Danny thought was her prettiest. Blue is a cool color, one that does not happen all that often in nature. So it is, I think, important to keep that in mind. Moving forward, let's talk about Jack a little bit. Coming to us from pages 96 and 97, when they are looking over the Overlook Hotel and all the Roque Court and the playground and things like this, they come to some hedges. "Do you like the animals?" Wendy asked. "That's called a topiary. Beyond the path leading to the Roque, Leading to Roke, there were hedges clipped into the shapes of various animals. Danny, whose eyes were sharp, made out a rabbit, a dog, a horse, a cow, and a trio of bigger ones that looked like frolicking lions. Those animals were what made Uncle Al think of me for the job, Jack told him. He knew that when I was in college, I used to work for a landscaping company. That's a business that fixes people's lawns and bushes and hedges. I used to trim a lady's topiary. And they go into a joke with that, which is a smooth way for King to play off the thematic connection between Jack and those hedge animals. Were it not for the hedge animals, Jack would not be in the Overlook Hotel. Jack is in the Overlook Hotel because of previous work experience. Previous work experience with sharp blades. But for anyone who, this isn't really a spoiler as much as keep your head up. For anyone who has read this novel before, and I don't think a big deal of this was made in the movie. I was not a fan of the movie, the Kubrick film. Those hedges are going to come back, and keep an eye on them, and keep an eye on what we're doing with the hedges and why the hedges remind us of Jack. I don't remember exactly, but I think there are going to be some things that worth discussing later. Talking about Jack and worth discussing later, here on page 110, as Halloran is giving them a tour of the kitchen, he gives us this little quote. "If you're a drinking man, I hope you brought your own supplies. Speaking of the bar, that place is picked clean." Just remember that. Just remember that as we move forward in this novel. Further, speaking of Jack, one thing that is sort of tertiarily connected here, we get this quote, if I can find it. Where am I going? Speaking of, oh boy, what is his name? The guy that works in the, Watson, the guy that sort of works in the basement of the hotel. It is said, I don't think I picked up on this the first time around, so maybe this is something I glossed over. Or maybe it wasn't mentioned, I'm not sure, but probably I just glossed over it. Speaking of Watson, there was money in that family long ago, Halloran is telling them. It was Watson's granddad or great-granddad, I can't remember which, that built this place. "So I was told," Jack said. "What happened?" Wendy asked. "Well, they couldn't make it go," Halloran said. "Watson will tell you the whole story, twice a day if you let him. We all know that guy. We all know that guy that will tell you every story twice a day if you let him. The fun thing to do with those guys is to memorize those stories and then start making up stories of your own that cut those stories off." I had a boss who was fond of telling about speed tables that used to be a business, used to be a regular in the specialty pharmacy business. Little speed tables. But you didn't want to have them too clean. If you have them too clean, people won't pick through them. So I would, every time he'd start that story, I'd say, I've noticed that with the travel size section, if you don't face it very well, people seem to shop it better. And it would just end his story. He wouldn't realize that he told it before, but that story would be ended because I had already come to that conclusion. But B, I think there is some commentary here to be had on the idea of transgenerational shortcomings. So the sins of our fathers affecting us from generations before, from generations prior. And I have not finished Dr. Sleep. I started Dr. Sleep a couple years ago, never finished it. I will probably get back to it at some point on this channel. But I wonder, after seeing the beginning of that, if there is some commentary being made there by seeing the fortune of Danny in the future. But the main thrust to be had from these 3 chapters, I think, is the entrance of a specific character. Here on page 88, he wanted Halloran to go over it with you. Halloran's the cook. Enter Dick Halloran. And Halloran is definitely worth discussing. He is someone that is going to be a building block of this novel and the mythos herein. But on top of that, he does have a function in the hotel itself. He is the cook. And on page 109, he is relaying this story. Anyway, Jack, I'd appreciate if you and your wife would keep an eye out for rats in the kitchen as well. Again, planting those seeds of the creepy crawlies. If you should see them, traps, not poison. Jack blinked. Of course. Who would put rat poison in the kitchen? Halloran laughed derisively. Ullman, that's who. That was his bright idea last fall. I put it to him. I said, what if we all get up here next May, Mr. Ullman, and I serve the traditional opening night dinner, which just happens to be salmon in a very nice sauce, and everybody gets sick and the doctor comes up and says to you, Ullman, what have you been doing up here? You've got 80 of the richest folks in America suffering from rat poisoning. Does that sound like another piece of literature to anyone? Now, I have not read Stephen King reference We All Lived in the Castle, or We Have Always Lived in the Castle before. But herein, in Danse Macabre, he mentions Shirley Jackson 6 times, I believe. E, F, G, H, I, J. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On 5 separate occasions, he mentions Shirley Jackson. He mentions House on Haunted Hill and The Lottery, predominantly. He doesn't mention We've Always Lived in the Castle, but you can bet your bottom dollar he's read it. And a good fiction writer is always willing to plant a little seed about their inspiration in a book. And if anyone's going to be mentioning those inspirations, mightn't it be Halloran? Someone who seems to see further than other characters. Because on page 105, we get this exchange, which is reminiscent of Darrell in As I Lay Dying. Looks sort of like a Doc, doesn't? So Halloran has referred to Danny as Doc. And Jack sort of stands back and says, wait a minute, how'd you know we call him Doc? And to this, Halloran replies, looks sort of like a Doc, doesn't he? He wrinkled his nose at Danny, smacked his lips and said, what's up, Doc? Danny giggled, and then Halloran said something. Sure you don't want to go to Florida, Doc? To him very clearly. He heard every word. He looked at Halloran, startled and a little scared. Halloran winked solemnly and turned back to the food. Wendy looked from the cook's broad, serge-clad back to her son. She had the oddest feeling that something had passed between them, something she could not quite follow. This is our first sign in this novel. This is our first sign in this novel that Halloran is using The Shining. We get another example on 107. If I can find it now. What are we doing here? Sorry, my sleeping pills are taking effect on me and I'm losing myself. So he's talking to Danny, or Halloran is still talking. You're gonna thank old. He snapped his fingers as if he had forgotten something. What's my name now? I guess it slipped my mind. Mr. Halloran, Danny said, grinning. Dick to your friends. That's right, and you being a friend, you make it Dick. As he led them into the far corner, Jack and Wendy exchanged a puzzled glance, both of them trying to remember if Halloran had told them his first name. Of course he had not. He has been conversing with Danny through The Shining all the while. Most of this not figuring its way into the commentary itself, into the story, into the dialogue. I should have marked this, but I did not. But that little scene leads us to another of Stephen King's works. And, I just realized. I spend all this time classifying and reclassifying and stating and restating. I'm not a Stephen King fan. I can enjoy Stephen King from time to time. I make a point to read a Stephen King every once in a while. But I always say I'm not a Stephen King fan. Yet here I am, reading a Stephen King book, and while talking about the Stephen King book, referencing two other Stephen King books. This is a stripped cover version of It. I can't believe that. But here on page 438, this is as Mike Hanlon is a child and his father is dying of cancer. And his father has agreed to tell him a story that he has never told him before because he's doped up on pain drugs. And here's one small excerpt from that story. The story is about Mike's father's time in the military, and when he and his friends had built a small bar because they were all black and they couldn't go to the places the other guys went, they were told, you can have this small place over here. So they built a spot called the Black Spot. There was a lot of bitterness about it, but what could we do? We had no real power. It was this young fellow, a PFC named Dick Halloran, who was a mess cook, who suggested that maybe we could fix it up pretty nice if we really tried. So here, in It, we have a sighting of Dick Halloran. So those guys, they do get together, they do fix this spot up, they do make it into the Black Spot, and the Black Spot becomes the place to be. Well, the racists in the town of Derry, they do not appreciate this. So they come out in full force, and during their attack, the Black Spot catches fire / is being burnt down. Then, Dick Halloran catches hold of him. He couldn't have been more than 19, and his eyes was as big as billiard balls. But he kept his head better than we did. He saved our lives. Not that way, he yells. This way. And he pointed back toward the bandstand. Toward the fire, you know. You're crazy, Trevor screamed back. He had a big bull voice, but you could barely hear him over the thunder of the fire and the screaming people. Die if you want to, but me and Willie are getting out. He still had me by the hand, and he started to haul me towards the door again. Although there were so many people around it by then, you couldn't see it at all. I would have gone with him. I would have gone with him. I was so shell-shocked I didn't know what the end was. All I knew was that I didn't want to be baked like a human turkey. Dick grabbed Trev by the hair of the head just as hard as he could, and when Trev turned back, Dick slapped his face. I remember seeing Trev's head bounce off the wall and thinking Dick had gone crazy. Then he was hollering in Trev's face, "You go that way, and you're gonna die." They jammed up against that door. You don't know that, Trev screamed back at him, and then there was a loud bang, like a firecracker. Only what it was the heat exploding from Marty Devereaux's bass drum. The fire was running along the beams overhead, and the oil on the floor was catching. I know it, Dick screams back, I know it. He grabbed the other hand. For a minute there, I felt like the rope was in a tug-of-war game. So basically what has happened here is Dick Halloran has used The Shining during during their place burning down to understand what's going on the other side of the wall where they've jammed the door shut. And he has seen that, and he is probably, I'm guessing the way he's seen that is he has forecasted through a Tony of his own their death if they go that way. So he's saying, I know that looks like the way to go, but we can't go that way. So this is Halloran back in the 40s using The Shining. And that is a nice little Easter egg in It by Stephen King, which was written after The Shining by Stephen King. And it's just a really nice way to give a wink and a nod to your reader. But that is all that I have for this episode, the third in a 15-part series, as we read through The Shining by Stephen King. And I hope to see you back here next week for episode 4, which will be pages 112 through 145 and chapters 11 through 13.